The prince believed he was lying with his wife in the royal bed. But when she turned around, he froze at what he saw. The golden light of dusk painted New Liberty's governor's mansion in hues of amber and bronze, casting long shadows across its manicured gardens and stone pathways. Inside, servants bustled about preparing for the evening's diplomatic dinner, their hushed voices barely disturbing the calculated quiet that defined the grand residence. This province, the jewel in the colonial crown of 18th century America, glittered with the promise of frontier gold and the shadow of native blood. Governor Benjamin Clarke stood at his study window, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the distant mountains. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. Tonight, those eyes reflected something rare: hesitation. "The Boston delegates have arrived, Governor," announced his steward, a thin man who seemed to materialize from the shadows. "Lady Julia is seeing to their accommodations." Benjamin nodded curtly. "Very good. And my correspondence from the southern frontier. On your desk, sir. Troubling reports, I'm afraid." When the steward departed, Benjamin exhaled slowly, reaching for the sealed letter. The tensions with the Cherokee nations were escalating again. More land disputes, more broken promises. Promises he'd been ordered to break by officials in Boston who had never set foot on frontier soil. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened to reveal Lady Julia, his wife of 3 years. She stood perfectly poised in the doorway, her posture and expression molded by Boston's finest finishing schools. "The delegates are asking for you, Benjamin," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive Northeast accent that still sounded foreign in New Liberty. "Mr. Harrington seems particularly eager to discuss the new taxation proposals." Benjamin studied his wife. Lady Julia was beautiful in a cool, untouchable way. Fair skin, auburn hair arranged in an elaborate style, green eyes that observed everything with quiet intelligence. Their marriage had been arranged by political necessity, a union to cement Boston's control over the increasingly independent-minded Western province. "I'll join them shortly," he replied. Julia lingered in the doorway. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." "Just the usual frontier conflicts," he answered, deliberately vague. They maintained this careful distance, polite, respectful, utterly lacking in intimacy. "I see." She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then turned to leave. "I've had the blue dining room prepared. Don't be too long." When the door closed, Benjamin loosened his cravat with an impatient tug. The marriage bed they shared was as cold as their conversations. A duty performed with mechanical precision when necessity demanded. He told himself it was enough. Most political marriages offered far less, but Benjamin knew different. He knew warmth. He knew passion. As the governor made his way to greet his guests on the opposite side of the mansion, in the servants' quarters, Grace moved quietly through her evening tasks. 25 years old with olive skin and dark, wavy hair kept modestly covered. She worked methodically, keeping her face partially turned away whenever someone passed. The right side of her face remained hidden behind a light veil, supposedly covering burns from a childhood accident. Only a handful of people in the mansion knew the truth, that beneath the veil lay deep scars deliberately inflicted when she was just a child. "Girl," called the head housekeeper sharply. "The red room needs fresh linens, quickly now." Grace nodded silently and gathered the required items as she worked. She heard whispers among the other servants about the Boston delegates. "They say they're here to tighten the leash on our governor," murmured one kitchen boy. "Hush that talk," warned an older servant. "Walls have ears, especially with Jeremiah Clarke prowling about." The mention of the governor's half-brother sent a chill through Grace. Jeremiah, with his watchful eyes and quiet footsteps, unsettled everyone in the household. Where Governor Benjamin commanded respect through strength, Jeremiah inspired fear through silence. He was leaner than his brother, darker in coloring and temperament, with knowledge of herbs and rituals that the colonists dismissed as native superstition, but whispered about behind closed doors. Grace finished her task and slipped outdoors to the garden shed, where she gathered cut flowers for the dining room. This was her momentary sanctuary, the small garden that separated the kitchen from the main house. In the growing darkness, she allowed herself a moment of peace. "You shouldn't be out alone at this hour," came a low voice. Grace didn't startle. She knew who it was without turning. "The flowers were needed for the dinner, Governor." Benjamin stepped from the shadows of a maple tree. In this hidden corner of the garden, away from prying eyes, they could speak freely, though rarely for long. "I had that dream again," he said quietly. "The one where I'm drowning in a river of gold." and all of Boston watches from the shore, placing bets on how long I'll last. Grace turned to face him fully, her unveiled side capturing the last light of day. Dreams speak in riddles, but rarely lie. He reached for her hand, an intimacy that would scandalize the entire province if witnessed. I have only minutes before I must entertain men who see this land as nothing but resources to be claimed. And what do you see when you look at this land, Benjamin? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I see its beauty, he said, his eyes fixed on her face. I see what others refuse to acknowledge. The double meaning hung in the air between them. Their forbidden relationship, a governor and a half-native servant, had begun a year ago, starting with garden conversations that grew increasingly intimate. Benjamin found in Grace what his political marriage lacked: understanding, passion, and a connection to the land he governed but didn't truly know. Inside the mansion, across marbled hallways and up the grand staircase, Lady Julia stood alone in her chambers. She dismissed her lady's maid, preferring solitude to the girl's incessant chatter as she adjusted her jewelry, pearls, appropriate for evening but not ostentatious. Her hand trembled slightly. The dreams had come again last night. A girl with her face, calling to her across a vast river, the same dream that had plagued her since childhood, growing more vivid since her arrival in New Liberty. Sometimes she woke gasping for air, as if she'd been underwater. Julia steadied herself against her dressing table. From its drawer, she withdrew a small object wrapped in silk, an unusual pendant with markings she didn't recognize. She'd found it hidden in the lining of her luggage months ago, with no explanation of how it got there or what it meant. Something about it felt important, forbidden. She kept it hidden, even from Benjamin. Downstairs, matriarcha Meredith Clarke, Benjamin's stepmother and widow of the former governor, observed the evening's preparations with hawk-like attention. At 65, she remained a formidable presence in the household, her influence extending into every corner of New Liberty society. The Boston delegates seem agitated this visit, remarked Jeremiah, appearing at her side. Perhaps they sense a shift in the wind. Meredith's lips thinned. What mischief are you planning, Jeremiah? I know that look. He smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. Simply ensuring our family's continued prosperity. Mother, Benjamin seems increasingly distracted lately. Leave your brother to me, she replied coolly. Focus on charming our guests. Your time will come. As dinner commenced in the blue dining room, the players took their places. Benjamin at the head of the table, Julia at his right, the Boston delegates arranged by importance. Jeremiah and Meredith strategically seated to observe and influence. Below stairs, Grace moved invisibly, part of the machinery that kept the mansion functioning, none fully aware of how their fates were interwoven, or how the seeds of revelation had already been planted. In the coming days, masks would slip, secrets would surface, and the carefully constructed hierarchies of New Liberty would face a reckoning none could anticipate. A fortnight after the Boston delegates departed, matriarch Meredith Clarke stood at her bedroom window, watching the autumn rain lash against the glass. Her chambers occupied the east wing of the governor's mansion, strategically positioned to observe both the formal gardens and the servants' entrance. Little escaped her notice. You're certain? She asked, not turning to face her lady's companion. Yes, ma'am, the woman replied. The governor visited the East Gardens again last night. He remained there nearly an hour with the half-breed girl. Meredith's fingers tightened on her cane, and Lady Julia, taking her evening tea in the library, oblivious as always. A thin smile crossed Meredith's face, history repeating itself. How predictable men were, even ones as supposedly principled as Benjamin. His father had been the same, seduced by exotic features and forbidden charms. The late Governor Clarke had betrayed her with a Cherokee woman, a diplomatic gift from a tribe seeking alliance. That indiscretion had yielded consequences Meredith had spent 20 years managing. Bring the girl to me, she ordered. Discreetly, when Grace arrived, she kept her eyes lowered, her veil in place. She stood with the perfect stillness that came from years of making herself invisible. Look at me, girl, Meredith commanded. Grace raised her head, but remained silent. Do you think I don't know what happens in my own home? Meredith's voice was soft, almost conversational. Did you imagine your little garden rendezvous with the governor went unnoticed? A flicker of fear crossed the visible half of Grace's face. Madam, Save your denials, Meredith cut her off. I'm not interested in your excuses. She circled Grace slowly, appraising her like livestock at auction. You look so much like her. Like who, ma'am? No one of consequence. Meredith paused, then changed course. Lady Julia has been unwell lately. Headaches, difficulty sleeping. She requires a companion during the night. Grace's brow furrowed slightly. There are other maids better suited. I've chosen you. Meredith's tone brooked no argument. You'll attend to her when called upon. Some nights she takes a sleeping draught that leaves her. Disoriented, you're to ensure she remains comfortable. Grace sensed the trap, but couldn't see its precise contours. Yes, ma'am. You may go, and Grace? Meredith called, as the young woman reached the door. The veil becomes you. Remember why you wear it? The threat hung in the air long after Grace departed. Meredith smiled to herself, satisfaction warming her veins. The plan was taking shape. If Benjamin wanted his native whore, he could have her. Under circumstances of Meredith's design, a child born of such unions, should one be conceived, would carry the blood Meredith secretly despised, yet be considered legitimate. The perfect revenge on her late husband's memory. In his private study, Jeremiah Clarke measured dried herbs with meticulous precision. The room smelled of tobacco and strange, pungent spices that clung to the heavy curtains. Unlike his half-brother's bright, official chambers, Jeremiah preferred shadows and seclusion. He added 3 drops of amber liquid to a small vial of wine, watching as the substances blended seamlessly. The tonic, he never called it poison, even in his thoughts, was an old Cherokee recipe, modified to his purposes, slow-acting, cumulative, with symptoms easily mistaken for natural illness. Fatigue, confusion, weakness. A knock interrupted his work. "Enter," he called, quickly stowing the vial in his desk drawer. Benjamin's steward appeared, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Clarke, the governor requests your presence at dinner tonight. The regional magistrates are visiting. How considerate of my brother to include me." Jeremiah's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell him I'd be delighted." When the steward left, Jeremiah removed the vial again, holding it to the light. The tonic had already begun working. Benjamin's occasional headaches, his recent pallor, the uncharacteristic fatigue after minimal exertion, small symptoms that would gradually worsen. Patience was essential. 6 more months, perhaps a year, and Benjamin would be too weak to govern effectively. By then, Jeremiah would have cultivated sufficient support among New Liberty's elite to position himself as the natural successor. And Lady Julia, she was a complication, but not an insurmountable one. Already, he'd begun his careful courtship, solicitous conversations in the library, shared interest in botanical drawings, subtle compliments that a neglected wife would notice. Julia was intelligent, perhaps too much so, but also isolated and increasingly desperate for meaningful connection. Jeremiah corked the vial and slipped it into his pocket. Tonight's dinner would provide another opportunity to add a few drops to his brother's wine. Lady Julia stood before her wardrobe, selecting a gown for the evening's dinner. Her lady's maid hovered nearby, offering suggestions that Julia barely heard. The headache that had plagued her since morning pressed behind her eyes like an iron band. "The blue silk, perhaps," the maid suggested. "The green," Julia decided, "with the silver trim." As the maid helped her dress, Julia's thoughts drifted to the strange dreams that had disturbed her sleep. Always the same: a river, a girl with her face calling from the opposite shore, the overwhelming sense of something lost. Last night, the dream had changed. The girl had held something in her hand, something that glinted in the sunlight. Once dressed, Julia dismissed her maid and retrieved the mysterious pendant from its hiding place. The object was unlike anything in her Boston upbringing. A flat stone disc with strange symbols carved into its surface, suspended on a leather cord. She had found it months ago, tucked into a hidden pocket of her traveling trunk, with no explanation of how it got there. Something about it felt important. As if it were trying to tell her a story she couldn't yet comprehend, Julia ran her thumb over the etched symbols, wondering at their meaning. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She quickly concealed the pendant in her sleeve. "Come in," she called. Grace entered, her veil in place, eyes downcast. "Matriarch Meredith sent me to attend you, my lady. She mentioned you've had trouble sleeping." Julia studied the servant girl curiously. They'd had minimal interaction since Julia's arrival in New Liberty, though she'd noticed Benjamin watching the girl on numerous occasions. "That's thoughtful of her," Julia replied. Though suspicion prickled at her spine, Meredith rarely did anything without calculation. "I've been having strange dreams, that's all." "Dreams can be powerful messengers," Grace said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. Forgive me. That's just something my grandmother used to say. Your grandmother was wise, Julia said. Intrigued by this glimpse of personality, what else did she tell you about dreams? Grace hesitated, then continued arranging Julia's hairbrushes. She said dreams are memories the soul doesn't want to forget, or warnings about paths not yet taken. And what would she make of dreaming about someone with your own face? Julia asked impulsively. Grace's hand stilled. My grandmother would say you've glimpsed your spirit twin. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. In Cherokee belief, we all have one. Another self who walks a different path. Cherokee, Julia echoed. Her interest piqued. You're familiar with their beliefs? Grace's posture stiffened. Only stories I've heard, my lady. New Liberty has many cultures. Before Julia could probe further, a clock chimed the dinner hour. I should go down, she said reluctantly. Will you be here later? I'd like to hear more about these beliefs. If that's what you wish, my lady. As Julia departed for dinner, she missed the look of troubled confusion on Grace's face, the visible half registering an emotion somewhere between fear and curious recognition. Downstairs, Benjamin stood at the dining room entrance, greeting the magistrates. Outwardly, he was the perfect colonial governor, commanding, articulate, attentive. Only Julia noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his wine glass, the shadow of pain that crossed his features when he thought no one was looking. Across the table, Jeremiah engaged the regional magistrate's wife in animated conversation, his charm on full display. When he caught Julia watching him, he offered a private smile that made her pulse quicken. Despite herself, in a household of political calculation and emotional restraint, such gestures of seeming genuine interest were dangerous currency. My dear, Benjamin said, as Julia took her seat. You look pale. Are you unwell? Just a headache, she assured him. Nothing serious. Perhaps you should retire early, he suggested, his concern seemingly genuine, yet somehow perfunctory. Perhaps, she agreed, though her thoughts were already elsewhere, on hidden pendants, spirit twins, and the veiled servant girl who spoke of Cherokee beliefs with unexpected familiarity. In the kitchen below, Grace prepared Lady Julia's evening tea, adding the sleeping draft matriarch Meredith had provided as she worked. Her fingers unconsciously reached for her own hidden pendant, the twin to the one Julia had discovered. Neither woman yet realized they each carried half of a secret that would soon change everything. Julia woke with a start, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. The dream had been more vivid than ever. This time, she'd crossed the river, reaching for the girl with her face, their fingers almost touching, before she was yanked back to consciousness, her heart hammered against her ribs. Disoriented, she lit the bedside candle. Benjamin's side of the bed was empty, untouched. Another late night with provincial paperwork, or so he claimed. Julia had stopped asking months ago. A movement in the shadowy corner of the bedroom made her gasp. Forgive me, my lady. Grace stepped forward, her veil in place even at this late hour. The matriarch instructed me to stay in case you needed anything. Julia clutched her blanket tighter. How long have you been there? A few hours. You were restless in your sleep, talking. What did I say? Julia asked, suddenly uneasy. Grace hesitated. You called a name, Kimi. The name resonated strangely, like an echo from somewhere deep in Julia's memory. That's odd. I don't know anyone by that name. It means secret in Cherokee, Grace said quietly, then quickly added, or so I've heard. Julia studied the servant girl with new interest. In the candlelight, the uncovered half of Grace's face seemed to shift and change, sometimes startlingly familiar. You know a great deal about Cherokee ways for a house servant. Grace turned away, busying herself with straightening items on the dressing table. Would you like some tea to help you back to sleep? My lady. No, Julia said firmly. She'd noticed how heavily she slept after the evening tea these past few nights. But I would like answers. She rose from the bed and crossed to her writing desk, unlocking a small drawer. From it, she withdrew the mysterious pendant. Do you recognize this? She asked, holding it where Grace could see. The reaction was immediate. Grace's visible eye widened, her hand instinctively reaching for something beneath her dress collar. Where did you find that? Grace whispered. Hidden in my luggage. I've had it for months, though I don't know how it got there. Julia took a step closer. You do recognize it, don't you? After a long moment, Grace slowly pulled out a leather cord from beneath her collar. Hanging from it was a pendant, identical to Julia's, with the same strange markings. but where Julia's was polished to a high sheen, Grace's was worn, the carvings partially obscured by years of handling. "My mother's," Grace said softly. "The only thing I have of hers." Julia felt the room tilt slightly, the implications too enormous to process. "And mine. Where would it have come from?" "I don't know." Grace's voice shook. "But there's a saying among the elders. Objects of power find their rightful owners, even across great distances." The two women stared at each other, the silence heavy with unasked questions. Finally, Julia broke it. "Tomorrow, I want you to tell me everything you know about these pendants, everything about your mother." Grace nodded once, then slipped silently from the room. Leaving Julia alone with her thundering thoughts, Benjamin hunched over his desk in the governor's study, squinting at trade documents that seemed to blur before his eyes. The headache had returned, worse than before, accompanied by a strange metallic taste in his mouth. "Work in late again." "Brother." Benjamin looked up to find Jeremiah lounging in the doorway, a decanter and 2 glasses in his hands. "Someone must," Benjamin replied dryly. "What brings you prowling at this hour?" "Brotherly concern." Jeremiah sauntered in, setting down the glasses and pouring generous measures of amber liquid. "You look terrible. Your compassion overwhelms me." Jeremiah pushed 1 glass toward Benjamin. "A medicinal draft. My own concoction. It'll help with the headaches." Benjamin eyed the drink suspiciously. "I've survived this long without your Cherokee remedies. And yet here you are, pale as a ghost. Hands shaking so badly you can barely sign your name." Jeremiah's tone was light, but his eyes were sharp. "Boston will notice eventually. They don't tolerate weakness in their governors." The barb hit its mark. Benjamin took the glass and downed its contents in 1 gulp, fighting the urge to gag at the bitter aftertaste. "There," Jeremiah said with a satisfied smile. "That wasn't so difficult now. Speaking of Boston, their latest dispatches make interesting reading. You've been intercepting my mail." Benjamin felt a flare of anger, momentarily cutting through the fog in his head. "Let's call it staying informed." Jeremiah circled the room, examining the maps on the wall with casual interest. "They're concerned about your handling of the Cherokee treaties, specifically, your reluctance to enforce the new territorial boundaries. Those boundaries cut through sacred burial grounds," Benjamin argued. "Enforcing them would provoke outright war. How convenient that you've developed such sympathy for native concerns," Jeremiah remarked. "I'm sure it has nothing to do with your midnight encounters with a certain half-breed servant." Benjamin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You do well to remember who governs this province, brother. For now," Jeremiah smiled thinly, "but governors can be replaced, especially those whose judgment appears compromised." After Jeremiah departed, Benjamin slumped back into his chair, the room spinning around him. The bitter draft had done nothing for his headache. If anything, the pain intensified. As he massaged his temples, his thoughts drifted to Grace, to her quiet strength and the peace he found in her presence. What would happen to her if he lost his position? The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his mysterious illness. In her private chambers, Matriarch Meredith reviewed her account ledgers by candlelight. The numbers were troubling. New Liberty's prosperity had always depended on expanding into Cherokee territory, and Benjamin's diplomatic hesitations were affecting trade. A soft knock interrupted her calculations. "Enter," she called sharply. Her lady's companion slipped in, looking agitated. "Forgive me, Matriarch, but there's something you should know. I was passing Lady Julia's chambers and overheard her speaking with the servant girl about matching pendants." Meredith's blood ran cold. "What pendants?" "Cherokee amulets, it seemed. The half-breed showed one that had belonged to her mother. Lady Julia had another. Identical." Meredith stood so quickly that her chair toppled backward. "Leave me. Alone." She paced the room, memories flooding back of the night 25 years ago when she had discovered her husband's betrayal. The Cherokee woman had borne twin girls, an event the natives considered powerfully spiritual. Meredith had ordered one infant marked and abandoned in the wilderness, keeping the other hidden until she could be sent away to Boston under a false identity, removing all evidence of their shameful origins. But she'd missed something. The pendants, tribal heirlooms passed from mother to daughter, must have been secreted away with the infants. Now, against all odds, both girls had found their way back to New Liberty, to this very house. And worse, they were discovering each other. Meredith's hands shook as she poured herself a measure of sherry. Her carefully constructed world was threatening to unravel. She needed to accelerate her plans. Grace slipped through the servants' corridors like a ghost, her mind racing. The pendant, the dreams, Lady Julia's strange familiarity. Pieces of a puzzle were falling into place, forming a picture too frightening to contemplate. She was so distracted that she nearly collided with Jeremiah in the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen. "Out late, aren't we?" he observed, blocking her path. His eyes lingered on her veil. "Matriarch Meredith required my service with Lady Julia," Grace answered, keeping her gaze lowered. "Did she now?" Jeremiah reached out and caught Grace's chin, forcing her to look at him. Strange business that, the governor's wife and his mistress becoming so intimate. Grace jerked away from his touch. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Don't you?" Jeremiah leaned closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "I see everything in this house, Grace. The governor's declining health, my stepmother's schemes, your little secret meetings with Lady Julia. I wonder what game you're playing." "No game, sir," Jeremiah smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "We all play games in this house. The question is whether you understand the stakes." He stepped aside to let her pass. "Sweet dreams. Grace, do give my regards to your mother's spirit." Grace hurried away, her heart pounding. Jeremiah knew something, perhaps everything. She needed to warn Julia, but how? The walls of the governor's mansion had ears, and now she knew Jeremiah's were among them. In her tiny attic room, Grace removed her veil and examined her reflection in a small hand mirror. The right side of her face bore the scars from that long-ago night, deliberately cut in a pattern that marked her as outcast among both natives and colonists. But beneath the scars, as she angled the mirror in the moonlight, she could see what others might miss. The same high cheekbones, the same shaped eyes as Lady Julia, the resemblance that had been hidden by a calculated act of cruelty. Grace closed her eyes, remembering fragments of her childhood. A woman's soft voice singing in Cherokee, the smell of sacred herbs, and always, the sense of something missing, someone missing, a piece of her soul walking a different path. Just as she had told Julia, sleep eluded her that night, as it did Julia in her grand bedroom and Benjamin in his study, all three caught in currents of destiny they couldn't yet comprehend. While elsewhere in the mansion, Jeremiah and Meredith laid their separate plans in darkness. 3 days passed before Julia and Grace found an opportunity to meet privately. The household buzzed with preparations for the harvest festival, giving Julia the perfect excuse to inspect the old stone greenhouse at the far edge of the estate, a place rarely visited by others. Julia arrived first, pacing nervously among the dormant plants and cracked glass panels. The greenhouse had fallen into disuse years ago, though someone, Grace she suspected, had maintained a small corner with medicinal herbs and flowers. The door creaked open, and Grace slipped inside, glancing behind her to ensure she hadn't been followed. "Were you seen?" Julia asked immediately. "No. I told the kitchen staff I was gathering late herbs for the festival cooking." Grace's voice was tight with tension. For a moment, the two women simply observed each other, in the filtered sunlight, even with the veil. Their similarities were striking. The same height, the same graceful posture, the same tilt of the head when listening. "Show me your pendant again," Julia said finally. Grace hesitantly removed her necklace. Placing it in Julia's palm, Julia set hers beside it. The two pieces were unmistakably crafted by the same hand, with identical markings except for a curved line on Grace's that continued onto Julia's, as if they were two halves of a whole. "They fit together," Julia whispered, aligning the pieces. When joined, they formed a perfect circle with a pattern that neither had recognized separately. A stylized tree with roots and branches intertwined. "The tree of peace," Grace said softly. "A sacred symbol." Julia looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" Grace touched her pendant with reverent fingers. "I've always known, somehow, like a memory just beyond reach." She hesitated. "You said you found yours hidden in your luggage. From Boston." "Yes, though I've never been entirely certain of my Boston origins." Julia sank onto a stone bench, suddenly needing support. "My earliest memories are of the Harrington household. They claimed I was a distant relation orphaned by fever, but never spoke of my parents." She looked up at Grace. "I was 5 years old when I came to them. Old enough that I should remember something before, but there's nothing, just emptiness." Grace slowly sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "My memories begin here, at the governor's mansion. I was told my mother was a servant who died in childbirth. The matriarch took me in out of Christian charity." Her voice turned bitter on the last words. "And this," Julia gestured to Grace's veil. A long silence stretched between them. Then, with trembling fingers, Grace lifted her veil. Julia couldn't suppress her gasp. The right side of Grace's face bore a pattern of scars, deliberate cuts that had healed into raised lines forming what appeared to be a broken circle. "They told me it was a fire," Grace said quietly, "but I've seen enough burns to know these were made with a blade." Julia reached out instinctively, her fingers hovering over the scars without touching them. Who would do such a thing? "I don't know. I was too young to remember." Grace replaced her veil. "But sometimes I dream of a woman screaming, and the matriarch standing over a cradle." Julia's blood ran cold. "I've dreamed of you," she admitted. "For years. A girl with my face calling across a river. I never understood until now." They sat in silence, the implications too enormous to voice aloud. "The dreams started when I arrived in New Liberty," Julia finally said, "as if something in me recognized this place. Or you. There's a Cherokee belief," Grace offered hesitantly, "that twins share one spirit divided between two bodies, even separated. They're never truly apart." "Twins," Julia whispered, the word both foreign and profoundly right. "But how and why would we be separated?" Grace's expression darkened. "The matriarch would know. She keeps the family records locked in her private study. Then we need to see those records," Julia decided, her aristocratic bearing asserting itself. "And I think I know how." Benjamin struggled to focus on the provincial council meeting, the voices around him seeming to come from underwater. The room tilted alarmingly when he tried to stand. "Governor," his chief advisor looked concerned. "Are you unwell?" "Just tired," Benjamin managed, gripping the table's edge. "Continue without me. My brother can represent my interests." Jeremiah smiled pleasantly, but triumph gleamed in his eyes. "Of course, brother. Rest yourself." In the hallway, Benjamin sagged against the wall, his vision swimming. A small, strong hand gripped his elbow. "Lean on me," Grace whispered. "Quickly, before others see." She guided him through a servant's passage to a small room off the kitchen, her private workspace for preparing medicinal herbs. "You're worse," she observed, helping him to a chair. "The headaches, almost constant now." Benjamin pressed his palms against his temples. "And strange symptoms, metallic taste, blurred vision, weakness." Grace's face paled behind her veil. "Show me your hands." She examined his fingernails, noting the bluish tinge. With gentle fingers, she pulled down his lower eyelid, revealing yellowed whites. "You're being poisoned," she said bluntly. Benjamin stared at her. "That's impossible. Who would—" He stopped, the answer obvious to them both. "Jeremiah has access to your food. Your wine," Grace said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "He knows native plant lore, including poisons that mimic natural illness. Surely someone would notice. Not if it's administered slowly. Over months." Grace began gathering herbs from her small store. "I can make a tincture to help flush the toxins, but you'll need to be careful. If he suspects you know." Benjamin caught her wrist, stilling her movements. "There's something else troubling you." Grace hesitated, caught between secrets. "Lady Julia and I, we've discovered something. Something dangerous." "What do you mean?" "I can't explain yet, but please, be wary of the matriarch as well." Grace pressed a small vial into his hand. 3 drops in water, morning and night. "Tell no one." Benjamin closed his fingers around the vial, his gaze lingering on Grace's face. Even now, ill and afraid, he found himself marveling at her strength. "If Jeremiah is truly poisoning me," he said quietly, "then none of us is safe, you least of all." In her chambers, Matriarch Meredith reviewed the household accounts with growing agitation. A knock interrupted her calculations. "Enter!" she called. Lady Julia stepped in, immaculately dressed for the evening's festival preparations. "Matriarch," she greeted with perfect courtesy. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Meredith studied her daughter-in-law with suspicion. In 3 years of marriage, Julia had rarely sought her company voluntarily. "What is it you need, my dear?" "Your guidance." Julia smiled disarmingly. "The Harvest Festival has different traditions here than in Boston. I want to ensure I represent the governor's household appropriately." "A bit late for such concerns, isn't it?" Julia lowered her eyes demurely. "I've been remiss in my duties as Benjamin's wife. Recent revelations have made me reconsider my role." Meredith's interest sharpened. "What revelations?" "That my husband's health is failing," Julia said softly, "and that New Liberty's future may soon be in different hands." The implication hung in the air between them. Meredith leaned back, reassessing the woman before her. "I see Jeremiah has been making his attentions known," she observed. Julia's cheeks colored slightly. He's been kind during Benjamin's frequent absences, and you've decided to be practical. Meredith's tone was approving. Perhaps there's more Clarke in you than I thought. I simply wish to secure my position, Julia replied. Whatever the future holds. Meredith smiled thinly. Then we understand each other. Come, I'll show you the festival traditions myself. As they departed together, neither noticed Grace slipping into the now empty room, quickly moving to the locked cabinet that held the family records with trembling hands. She used the key she'd secretly borrowed from Julia's ring, copied from the master key Julia had taken from Benjamin's study. The cabinet yielded easily, revealing leather-bound volumes and bundles of yellowed papers. Grace worked methodically, scanning birth records, correspondence, household accounts. Then she found it, a small journal hidden beneath official documents, the matriarch's private diary from 25 years ago. Her heart pounding, Grace read the faded entries. March 15th. The Cherokee woman died today. Fever, the physician claims, though I suspect she simply lost the will to live after we took the infants. Twin girls, a complication I hadn't anticipated. The governor is distraught, though he tries to hide it. He doesn't yet know what I've planned for his precious half-breed daughters. March 20th. One child has been marked and left with a servant family on the estate. The tribal markings will ensure she's never accepted in proper society. The other will be sent to Boston once she's weaned, with a fabricated background. The governor knows nothing. He believes both died with their mother. It's better this way. His indiscretion remains hidden, and I retain control of the estate. March 25th. The infant's tribal pendants were nearly discovered, superstitious trinkets, supposedly protective talismans for twins. I've hidden them away. Such pagan symbols have no place in a Christian household. Grace's hands shook so badly she could barely replace the journal. The truth, stark and horrifying, was worse than she'd imagined. She and Julia weren't just sisters. They were twins, deliberately separated, and their identities obscured by the matriarch's cruelty. Footsteps in the hallway startled her. Hastily, she relocked the cabinet and slipped out through the servants' passage, the terrible knowledge burning in her mind like fire. Outside, the autumn sun was setting, casting long shadows across New Liberty as the harvest festival began. Bonfires were lit in the town square, symbolizing prosperity and renewal. But within the governor's mansion, older, darker forces were stirring, secrets long buried, now clawing their way to the surface. The harvest festival continued for 3 days, its raucous celebrations providing perfect cover for clandestine meetings. On the final night, Julia slipped away from the main festivities, her hooded cloak concealing her identity as she hurried to the greenhouse. Grace was already waiting, her face drawn with anxiety even behind her veil. "You found something," Julia said immediately. Recognizing the tension in her newly discovered twin's posture, Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "The matriarch's journal. It confirms everything we suspected, and worse." She recounted the damning entries, watching Julia's face drain of color. "So our mother was Cherokee," Julia said slowly. "And our father, the former Governor Clarke," Grace finished. "Matriarch Meredith's husband." Julia sank onto the stone bench, her world tilting on its axis. "Which makes Benjamin our half-brother," Grace confirmed, her voice tight. "And Jeremiah as well." The implications crashed over them like a wave. Julia pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting a wave of nausea. "My marriage to Benjamin, it was arranged by the Boston families, did they know?" "I doubt it. The journal said your background was fabricated. Only the matriarch knows the truth." Julia's eyes flashed with sudden anger. She orchestrated everything. My upbringing in Boston, my marriage to Benjamin, bringing me back to the very house where I was born, without my knowledge. And she marked me. Grace touched her veiled cheek, to ensure I would never rise above my station, never challenge her story. The two women sat in stunned silence, processing their shared history. Finally, Julia reached for Grace's hand, squeezing it tightly. "There's more," Grace said reluctantly. "Benjamin is being poisoned, slowly, carefully. I believe by Jeremiah." "Dear God," Julia whispered. "Are you certain?" "The symptoms are unmistakable. I've given him a tincture to help." "But," Grace hesitated, "there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone." She took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to her abdomen. "I'm with child. Benjamin's child." The confession hung in the air between them. "How long have you known?" Julia asked quietly. 2 weeks. The morning sickness is just beginning." "Does Benjamin know?" Grace shook her head. I've been afraid to tell him with his health declining, Jeremiah's growing influence." She looked away. "And now, knowing we share the same father, that changes nothing," Julia said firmly. "What happened before we knew the truth is not our burden to bear." She squeezed Grace's hand again. "We must protect you and the child, and find a more permanent cure for Benjamin." "There's someone who might help," Grace said hesitantly. "A Cherokee healer in the mountains. She knows antidotes for the old poisons, things beyond my limited knowledge. Can you reach her? It's dangerous. The mountain passes are watched by militiamen, and for a woman alone, especially one marked as I am." "You won't go alone," Julia declared. "I'll accompany you." Grace stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. The governor's wife can't simply disappear into the mountains." "No, but his cousin from Boston can," Julia countered, "with a suitable escort of servants, including her veiled lady's maid." A slow smile spread across the visible half of Grace's face. "You've thought this through." "I was raised to be diplomatic and resourceful," Julia said with grim determination. "It's time I used those skills for something that truly matters." Benjamin hunched over his desk, forcing himself to focus on the trade documents before him. The tincture Grace had provided offered some relief, but his condition continued to deteriorate. His hands shook visibly as he reached for his quill. "Brother, you look positively ghastly," Jeremiah observed from the doorway. "Perhaps you should retire for the evening." Benjamin looked up wearily. "The quarterly reports can't wait. Boston expects them by the next ship." "Allow me to assist." Jeremiah sauntered in, picking up the half-empty wineglass on Benjamin's desk. "You've barely touched your refreshment. I find I have little appetite these days." "A concerning symptom." Jeremiah studied the wineglass thoughtfully. "The physician suggests it might be a wasting illness, perhaps contracted from questionable associations." The thinly veiled reference to Grace made Benjamin's jaw tighten. "Your concern is noted." "It's more than concern, brother." Jeremiah set down the wineglass and leaned forward. "The council is worried. There's talk of appointing a temporary regent until your health improves. And I suppose you've volunteered for the position." Jeremiah spread his hands in mock humility. "Someone must maintain stability. The frontier disputes grow more pressing, and Boston demands action on the Cherokee boundaries." Benjamin studied his half-brother, seeing clearly for the first time the calculated ambition behind his solicitous manner. "I'm not dead yet, Jeremiah." "Of course not," Jeremiah smiled thinly. "But in matters of governance, appearance is reality, and you, brother, appear increasingly incapable." After Jeremiah departed, Benjamin reached for the wineglass, then stopped himself. With shaking hands, he poured the contents into a potted plant, watching as the liquid soaked into the soil. How long had Jeremiah been poisoning him? Months, certainly. Since before Julia's arrival from Boston, the realization sent a chill through him. His half-brother's patience was frightening. A slow, methodical path to power. Benjamin opened his desk drawer, reaching for Grace's vial. 3 drops in water. She had instructed. He doubled the dose. In the foothills beyond New Liberty's settlements, an old woman worked alone in a small cabin, known to colonists simply as the Mountain Witch, and to Cherokee as Umani, Mother of Healing. She lived between 2 worlds, trusted by neither, essential to both. As she crushed herbs with a stone mortar, Umani paused, her weathered hand frozen in mid-motion. A sensation like a plucked thread vibrated through her consciousness. "So," she murmured to the empty cabin, "the sisters have found each other." She had known this day would come. 25 years ago, she had delivered twin girls to the Cherokee woman and the governor. When the mother died and the matriarch enacted her cruel plan, Umani had been powerless to intervene directly, but she had ensured each infant kept her protective pendant, tokens that would one day lead them back to each other and to their true heritage. Umani resumed her work, adding dried roots to her mixture. Soon the sisters would seek her out. She needed to be ready. Julia found Benjamin in his study later that evening, his complexion alarmingly gray despite the fire's warm glow. "You should be in bed," she said, genuine concern in her voice. Benjamin looked up, surprised by her presence in recent months. They had rarely sought each other's company. "The work doesn't stop for illness," he replied. Julia closed the door and approached his desk. "Grace told me about the poison." Benjamin stiffened. "She shouldn't have involved you." "Did you think I wouldn't notice my husband's declining health?" Julia's tone softened. "We may not have a love match, Benjamin, but I don't wish to see you suffer." He studied her with new awareness. "You've changed since your arrival in New Liberty. Perhaps I've found purpose here." She hesitated, then continued carefully. Grace and I have discovered certain connections between us. Family connections. Benjamin's expression remained neutral, but Julia noted how his hand tightened on his quill. How much do you know? He asked quietly. Enough to understand the matriarch's manipulations. Enough to know that my presence here is no coincidence. She met his gaze steadily. We need to protect Grace. And your child. Benjamin's quill clattered to the desk. She told you. Yes, and we have a plan to help you both. Quickly, Julia outlined their intention to seek the mountain healer. I'll claim a desire to sketch the autumn foliage. The matriarch will suspect nothing if you authorize the expedition. It's too dangerous, Benjamin protested. The mountain trails, the militiamen, more dangerous than remaining here, with Jeremiah increasing your dosage and the matriarch discovering Grace's condition, Julia countered. We leave tomorrow at first light. Can you hold out until our return? Benjamin nodded slowly. Be careful, both of you. As Julia turned to leave, he called after her. Julia, thank you for helping her when I cannot. She paused at the door. She's my sister, she said simply, the word still new and precious on her tongue. Dawn painted the eastern sky as a small party departed the governor's mansion. Lady Julia, ostensibly traveling to sketch the famous red gold foliage of the mountain forests, accompanied by 2 guards and her veiled lady's maid, from her window, Matriarch Meredith watched their departure with narrowed eyes, noting the unusual number of provisions for a simple sketching expedition. Behind her, Jeremiah lounged against the doorframe. Curious timing, he remarked. The governor's wife suddenly developing an interest in mountain scenery. Follow them, Meredith ordered. Discreetly, find out what they're really seeking, and if I discover something inappropriate. Meredith turned from the window, her expression cold. Then you ensure Lady Julia understands the consequences of disloyalty. As the small party disappeared down the forest road, Grace felt the weight of the journey ahead. Her hand moved protectively to her still flat abdomen, where Benjamin's child grew, a child who represented both danger and hope. Beside her, Julia rode with the straight-backed confidence of her Boston upbringing, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. Neither woman noticed the solitary rider who departed half an hour later, following their trail into the misty mountains where Umani waited, her ancient knowledge ready for those with the courage to seek it. The mountain journey took 3 days, following winding trails that grew increasingly narrow and treacherous. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a punishing storm. We should seek shelter, Julia called to the guards riding ahead. The sky looks threatening. The lead guard pointed to a small column of smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. There's a settlement ahead, my lady. Perhaps they'll offer lodging. Grace exchanged a meaningful glance with Julia. They had been following landmarks provided by one of the kitchen servants with Cherokee connections. A bent pine, a fork in the stream, a rock formation resembling a sleeping bear. The smoke likely marked Umani's cabin. As they crested the ridge, they found not a settlement, but a solitary cabin nestled against the mountainside. Protected by overhanging rock, a small garden of strange-looking plants surrounded it, and drying herbs hung from the eaves. The witch's cabin, one guard muttered, making a protective sign across his chest. Don't be superstitious, Julia chided, though her own heart hammered with apprehension. It's merely an old woman living in seclusion. As if summoned by their voices, the cabin door opened. A woman emerged, small, ancient, her silver hair braided with colored threads, her dark eyes sharp as a hawk's. She wore a curious mixture of Cherokee and colonial garments. I've been expecting you, she called in perfect English. Come before the storm breaks. The guards hesitated, clearly reluctant to approach. You two may camp in that sheltered grove. Umani indicated a stand of pines nearby. The women will stay in my cabin. My lady, the senior guard protested. We can't leave you with, you can and will, Julia replied firmly. We'll be perfectly safe. The storm is nearly upon us, and I won't have you without shelter on my account. Reluctantly, the guards led their horses toward the grove, casting suspicious glances back at the old woman. Umani watched with amusement. Men fear what they cannot control, she observed. Come inside, daughters of 2 worlds. We have much to discuss before the storm passes. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly spacious, filled with drying plants, clay pots of mysterious substances, and shelves of carefully labeled vials. A fire burned in a central hearth, filling the space with aromatic smoke. "You know why we've come," Grace said, removing her veil. Now they were away from the guards. Umani approached her, examining the scars with gentle fingers. "The mark of the broken circle," she murmured. "Meredith Clarke's handiwork. I recognize her cruelty." "You know the matriarch?" Julia asked. "I know all who dwell in these mountains. Whether they acknowledge me or not." Umani motioned for them to sit on woven mats near the fire. "I delivered you both into this world. I watched your mother die of grief when they took you from her, and I've waited for the day you would find your way back to each other, and to me." The twins sat in stunned silence. "Our mother," Grace finally whispered. "What was she like?" Umani's weathered face softened. Alsuna was the daughter of a Cherokee chief, sent to the governor's household as part of a peace negotiation. She was beautiful, educated by missionaries, fluent in 3 languages. The governor fell in love with her, though he kept their relationship secret. "And we were born after his death?" Julia asked. "Yes, the governor died unexpectedly, some say suspiciously. While Alsuna was with child, Meredith, always cold toward her husband's Cherokee concubine, became openly hostile. When Alsuna delivered twins, a powerful omen among Cherokee, Meredith saw an opportunity for vengeance." Thunder rumbled outside. Closer now, Umani rose to add herbs to the fire, filling the cabin with a calming scent. "But why separate us?" Grace pressed. "Why the elaborate deception?" "Power and bloodlines," Umani said simply. "The governor left provisions for Alsuna and any children she might bear. Meredith couldn't tolerate native blood inheriting what she considered rightfully hers, particularly female native blood. But neither could she risk the scandal of the governor's half-Cherokee daughters becoming known, so she crafted a solution that satisfied her cruelty and her practicality." Julia's hand found Grace's, gripping it tightly. "And now Benjamin is being poisoned by Jeremiah." "Yes," Umani nodded. "With rot-root extract. Slow, nearly untraceable. It mimics natural wasting illnesses. Can it be counteracted?" Grace asked urgently. "There is an antidote." Umani moved to her shelves, selecting various dried plants. "But first, let me see what grows within you, child." She placed her hand on Grace's abdomen, closing her eyes in concentration. "A strong spirit," she murmured. "A daughter. She carries both bloodlines in perfect balance." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Will she be safe, with everything happening at the mansion?" "That depends on choices yet unmade." Umani began grinding herbs with practiced movements. "The storm that gathers is not just outside these walls. Jeremiah follows your trail. He will reach this cabin by morning," Julia started. "How can you know that?" "The birds told me," Umani said, her eyes twinkling. At Julia's skeptical expression, she laughed. "Or perhaps I glimpsed a lone rider following your path when I gathered water this morning. Either way, you have until dawn to decide your course." Through the night, as rain lashed the cabin and thunder shook the mountains, Umani prepared 2 medicines, the antidote for Benjamin's poisoning and a protective tonic for Grace's pregnancy. She spoke of Cherokee traditions, of the twins' maternal lineage, of the power that flowed in their blood. "The pendants you carry," she said, examining the 2 halves of the disc, "form the seal of your mother's clan, the ancient right to speak for her people in council. Together, they represent a claim to leadership that supersedes colonial authority in these territories." "No wonder the matriarch hid them," Julia mused. "They're tangible proof of our legitimacy." As dawn approached, the storm intensified rather than abating. Umani packed the medicines carefully, along with detailed instructions. "You must leave before Jeremiah arrives," she instructed. "There's a hidden trail behind the cabin. It leads to a Cherokee settlement where you'll find allies. From there, you can return to New Liberty by the eastern route. Come with us," Grace urged. "You're not safe here if Jeremiah discovers your role." Umani smiled gently. "My path lies here. Some must stand their ground for others to advance." She pressed a small bundle into Julia's hands. "This healing salve, apply it to Grace's scars daily. The wounds were made with a cursed blade, but even such magic can be undone with patience." They departed in the gray light before dawn, rain still falling in sheets. The guards, miserable after a night exposed to the elements, asked no questions about their hasty departure or the strange direction Umani pointed them toward. Benjamin woke in his bedchamber, disoriented. The last thing he remembered was working in his study, then a sudden wave of dizziness. Now, lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating his room in harsh bursts. His mouth felt dry, his limbs leaden. Pushing himself upright, he realized someone was in the room with him, a female figure silhouetted against the window. "Julia," he called, his voice raspy. "I'm afraid not," replied Matriarch Meredith, turning to face him. "Lady Julia is still on her sketching expedition." She approached his bed, her face illuminated by a sudden lightning flash. "You're looking particularly ill tonight, Benjamin. Perhaps I should summon the physician." "That won't be necessary," he managed. Reaching for the water glass on his bedside table, his hand trembled violently, spilling half the contents. "Allow me," Meredith said, taking the glass and refilling it from a pitcher. "Jeremiah mentioned your condition is worsening. Such a shame." Benjamin accepted the water cautiously. "Where is Jeremiah?" "Attending to some business in the mountains," Meredith replied with careful neutrality. "Provincial security matters." Understanding dawned on Benjamin with sickening clarity. "You sent him after Julia and Grace." "I sent him to investigate a suspicious departure," Meredith corrected, "though I'm curious why you immediately assumed it involved your wife and that servant girl." The room tilted alarmingly as Benjamin tried to stand. Meredith watched him passively as he sank back onto the bed. "What have you given me?" he gasped. "Nothing that wasn't already in your system," she replied. "Just a larger dose. Jeremiah has been quite methodical, but some situations require more. Immediate results." Another lightning flash illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. The storm was directly overhead now, rain lashing against the windows like thrown pebbles. "Why?" Benjamin asked, fighting to remain conscious. "What do you gain from my death?" Meredith regarded him with something almost like pity. "Control." "Benjamin, this province has been Clarke territory for 3 generations. I won't see it pass to Boston appointees or half-breed pretenders. Jeremiah isn't even a true Clarke," Benjamin managed, his speech slurring. "He's my mother's son from her first marriage, but raised as a Clarke, with Clarke values," Meredith countered. "Unlike you, with your native sympathies and misplaced idealism." She moved to the door. "Rest now. By morning, this will all be resolved. Your inconvenient illness, your wife's unusual friendships, and the last loose ends of my late husband's indiscretions." After she departed, Benjamin lay in the darkness, lightning periodically illuminating his room like ghostly visitations. He thought of Grace in the mountains, carrying his child, pursued by Jeremiah, of Julia, whose cool exterior masked unexpected loyalty, of the poison working through his system, pulling him toward oblivion with tremendous effort. He reached beneath his mattress, fingers searching for the small vial Grace had given him before departing, the last of her medicinal tincture, which he had rationed carefully. 3 drops, she had said in desperation. He drained the entire vial. The effect was immediate and violent. Convulsions that arched his back off the bed, a burning sensation that spread from his stomach to his extremities. As consciousness slipped away, a final lightning flash illuminated the room. In that instant, the bedroom door opened. A veiled figure entered, soaked from the storm, moving swiftly to his bedside. "Grace," he whispered as darkness claimed him. But it wasn't Grace who stood over him, water dripping from her veil onto his face. It was Grace's face, but without scars. Identical, perfect, determined. Julia, he managed in confusion before consciousness fled completely. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating the truth that had been literally before his eyes all along. 2 women with one face, separated by cruelty, united by blood, their destinies converging in the governor's mansion on this storm-racked night. Benjamin hovered between life and death for 3 days. Julia rarely left his bedside, administering Umani's antidote in careful doses, watching for each small sign of improvement. The convulsions had stopped by the 2nd day, but fever still gripped him, bringing delirious mutterings and moments of confused lucidity. "Grace," he called again, his eyes opening briefly before sliding closed. "Rest," Julia soothed, wiping his brow with a cool cloth. "You're fighting the poison. Every hour you grow stronger." She glanced nervously at the door. They had returned to find the mansion in disarray, the matriarch claiming Benjamin had suffered a collapse, physicians summoned and dismissed, rumors spreading through New Liberty about the governor's impending death. Julia had pushed through the chaos with unexpected authority, dismissing the hovering doctors and taking charge of Benjamin's care herself. But Grace remained hidden in the servants' quarters, too weak from the grueling return journey to risk exposure, and Jeremiah had not returned from the mountains. A soft knock interrupted Julia's thoughts. She quickly concealed the vial of antidote before calling, "Enter." The matriarch stepped into the room, her face composed in an expression of maternal concern. "Any improvement?" "His fever is less severe," Julia replied carefully. "The physician believes the crisis has passed." "How fortunate." Meredith approached the bed, studying Benjamin with calculating eyes. "And how unexpected. The symptoms appeared so dire. Perhaps his constitution is stronger than it appeared." "Perhaps." Meredith's gaze shifted to Julia. "Or perhaps he received some extraordinary treatment during my absence from his sick room." Julia met her stare evenly. "I've done nothing but follow the physician's instructions." "Of course." Meredith circled the bed slowly. "Your dedication to your husband is admirable, especially given the unconventional nature of your marriage." "Benjamin is a good man," Julia said simply. "He deserves loyalty." "Loyalty," Meredith echoed. "An interesting choice of word. Tell me, where is your lady's maid?" "The veiled one. I haven't seen her since your return." "Resting?" The mountain journey was difficult. Indeed, particularly when one takes an unplanned detour to visit a notorious witch. At Julia's startled expression, Meredith smiled thinly. "Jeremiah is quite thorough in his investigations." "Is he?" Julia's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Then he must have told you we sought a remedy for Benjamin's mysterious illness." A noble explanation. Meredith stopped at the foot of the bed. "But we both know there's more to the story, don't we?" On the bed, Benjamin stirred, mumbling incoherently. Julia leaned forward, adjusting his blankets, using the moment to compose herself. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, straightening. "No." Meredith moved to the window, her back to Julia. "Then allow me to illuminate matters. My son is being systematically poisoned. My daughter-in-law has formed an unlikely alliance with a half-breed servant. Together they visit a Cherokee witch known for her knowledge of antidotes and—" She paused meaningfully. "Midwifery." Julia's blood ran cold. Somehow, Meredith knew everything. Benjamin's poisoning, Grace's pregnancy, their visit to Umani. "What do you want?" Julia asked quietly. "Want?" Meredith turned, her face hard. "I want what I've always wanted, to protect the Clarke legacy, to ensure this province remains under proper control, Jeremiah's control." "You mean, he understands what's necessary?" Meredith nodded. "Unlike Benjamin, with his native sympathies and weak governance. By necessary, you mean stealing Cherokee land, betraying treaties, poisoning your own stepson. Politics requires difficult choices," Meredith replied coldly. "Choices I've been making since before you were born." "Yes," Julia said, her voice hardening. "Since you separated twin infants, scarred one for life, and sent the other to Boston under a false identity." The words hung in the air between them. For the first time, Meredith appeared genuinely startled. "So," she said after a long moment. "You know, we found your journal," Julia confirmed. "We know everything. About our mother, about our father, about what you did to us." "Us?" Meredith's eyes narrowed. "You speak as if Grace is my sister, my twin." Julia stood, drawing herself to her full height. "She is. We've confirmed it beyond doubt." Meredith sank into a chair, suddenly looking her age. "Impossible. The markings I gave her were cruel, but ultimately superficial," Julia finished. "They couldn't hide the truth forever." Outside, rain began to fall again, gentler than the previous storm, but steady and persistent. Benjamin's breathing had settled into a more regular rhythm, giving Julia courage. "Why?" she asked. "Why separate us? Why the elaborate deception?" Meredith stared out at the rain, her expression distant. "My husband was besotted with that Cherokee woman. He intended to recognize their children, to give them a place in provincial society." Her mouth twisted bitterly. Imagine the scandal. The governor's half-breed daughters, with potential claims to both colonial and native authority. "So you erased us," Julia said. "You remade us to suit your purposes." "I did what was necessary to preserve order," Meredith snapped. New Liberty was balanced on a knife's edge. Pressure from Boston. Threats from the frontier. The province needed strong, undivided leadership, not complications from my husband's indiscretions. "And now?" Julia pressed. "What's necessary now? More poison for Benjamin. Eliminating Grace and her unborn child. Silencing me." Meredith's head snapped up. "She's with child." "Benjamin's child," Julia confirmed. watching shock and calculation war on the older woman's face. That complicates matters, Meredith murmured, almost to herself. It exposes your schemes, Julia corrected. A legitimate heir, with Cherokee blood, exactly what you've been trying to prevent for 25 years. Meredith stood abruptly, pacing the room. Jeremiah will never allow it. The child, the mother, both will meet with accidents. Is that a threat? A prediction? Meredith replied coldly. My stepson is not known for his restraint when his ambitions are threatened. Julia moved to stand between Meredith and the bed. I won't let you hurt them. Any of them. Bold words from a woman who, until recently, thought herself a Boston aristocrat. Meredith's smile was razor-sharp. You have no power here, Julia. No allies beyond a marked servant and a half-dead governor. You're wrong, Julia said quietly. I have the truth, and I'm prepared to use it. She withdrew a folded document from her pocket. A letter detailing everything. The twins separated at birth, Benjamin's poisoning, Jeremiah's ambitions. Copies have been sent to Boston, to the provincial council, and to the Cherokee elders. If anything happens to me, to Grace, to Benjamin or the child, the letters will be delivered. Meredith's face drained of color. You wouldn't dare. The scandal would destroy you as well. Perhaps, Julia acknowledged. But I've discovered something these past weeks, matriarch. There are things more important than appearances, position, or power. Family, truth, justice. Meredith's composure cracked, revealing naked fury beneath. You self-righteous little... She lunged forward, reaching for Julia's throat with clawed hands. Enough! Benjamin's voice, weak but determined, cut through the confrontation. Both women turned to the bed. Benjamin had pushed himself to a sitting position, his face pale but his eyes clear. How much did you hear? Meredith demanded. Everything, he replied hoarsely. Every word. Meredith straightened, adjusting her shawl with trembling hands. You're delirious, Benjamin. Hallucinating from fever. Whatever you think you heard. I heard the truth, he interrupted. About Julia and Grace, about my father and their mother, about the poison. His gaze hardened. About your complicity in all of it. Meredith backed toward the door. You have no proof. No one will believe. Everyone will believe, Benjamin countered. Because you're going to confess, Mother. To the council. To Boston. To everyone. A harsh laugh escaped Meredith's lips. You think I would destroy myself? For what? Your misplaced sense of justice. For survival, Benjamin said simply. Confess to the lesser crimes. The deception about the twins. The cover-up of my father's relationship. Paint yourself as a woman protecting her family's reputation in difficult times. The council might understand such motives. He let the implication hang. The alternative was exposure of her role in his poisoning. A capital offense. Meredith's calculating mind worked visibly behind her eyes. And if I agree to this, confession, you'll retire to the family estate in Virginia, Benjamin said. Comfortable, respectable isolation. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Meredith nodded stiffly. I will consider your proposal. As she reached for the door handle, she swayed suddenly, her hand flying to her chest. I feel, she gasped, her face contorting in pain. Julia rushed forward as Meredith collapsed. Help! Someone come quickly! Servants flooded the room. Confusion and panic spreading as they carried the matriarch to her chambers. The household physician was summoned, emerging from her room an hour later with a grave expression. Poison, he announced to the stunned household. Similar to Governor Clarke's symptoms, but administered in a single, massive dose. Benjamin, supported by Julia, had dragged himself to the matriarch's bedside. Who would do this? He demanded, though the answer seemed obvious. Jeremiah, ensuring his stepmother couldn't implicate him. But the matriarch, lucid in her final moments, offered a different explanation. Ironic, she whispered to Benjamin and Julia. The wine, meant for you. I poured it myself, but took the wrong glass. Her eyes found Julia's, a strange clarity in them. You were right, she murmured. The truth has its own power. Listen carefully, as rain drummed against the windows. Meredith Clarke made her final confession, confirming everything Julia had discovered and revealing more. Jeremiah's plans for a coup, secret agreements with foreign powers, and the location of documents that would prove it all. When she finally fell silent, Benjamin leaned closer. I forgive you, he said, though whether from genuine compassion or calculated political grace, even he couldn't have said. A bitter smile touched Meredith's lips. "Save your forgiveness," she managed. "Some sins cannot be absolved." Her gaze shifted to Julia. "Find the other girl, the marked one. Tell her." But whatever final message Meredith intended for Grace died with her. As the poison claimed its unintended victim, the matriarch's funeral proceeded with all the ceremony New Liberty could muster. Black crepe draped the governor's mansion, and the provincial elite filed through to pay their respects, their whispers trailing behind them like shadows. The official account, that Meredith Clarke had succumbed to the same mysterious illness affecting the governor, was accepted with public solemnity and private skepticism. Benjamin, still weak but recovering, made a brief appearance, supported by Julia. His pallor and trembling hands only reinforced the narrative of a family struck by tragedy and illness. "Where is Jeremiah Clarke?" the magistrate's wife whispered to her husband. "His absence at his stepmother's funeral seems peculiar." "Frontier business, I'm told," her husband replied, "though some say he hasn't been seen since he rode into the mountains a week ago." As mourners departed, Julia helped Benjamin to his study, where Grace waited, still veiled but dressed in the black of mourning. "No sign of Jeremiah?" Benjamin asked as he sank into his chair. Grace shook her head. "None. The scouts report no trace of him beyond Umani's cabin. She warned me he might not return from the mountains," Julia added. "The Cherokee settlement where we sheltered. They seemed prepared for his arrival." Benjamin nodded slowly. "Justice comes in many forms." He looked up at the twins, still marveling at their identical features, despite Grace's scars, which were already beginning to fade from Umani's salve. "We should be grateful for the reprieve, however temporary. It gives us time to implement our plan." Julia unfolded a map on the desk. "I've located the documents the matriarch mentioned in her confession. Letters between Jeremiah and French officials, promising territorial concessions in exchange for military support, financial records showing embezzlement from provincial coffers. And this," she placed a leather-bound volume beside the map, "the true record of our birth, with witness signatures. And I found these," Grace added, placing 2 miniature portraits on the desk. One showed the former governor, a stern-faced man with kind eyes. The other depicted a beautiful Cherokee woman in a blend of native and colonial dress. "Our parents." Benjamin studied the portraits with a complex expression. "My father kept her image hidden in his private chambers. I discovered it as a boy but never knew who she was." He glanced up at Grace. "Now I see her in both of you." The three fell silent, contemplating the strange bonds that connected them. Half-siblings and former lovers, twins separated by cruelty, now united by necessity. "The provincial council meets in 3 days," Benjamin finally said. "They expect me to name a temporary regent while I recover. They assume it will be Jeremiah. And instead," Grace prompted, "instead I will reveal the truth about Jeremiah's treachery, using the documents we've found." Benjamin's hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. "But that's only the beginning." Julia leaned forward. "You're thinking of our plan." "Yes." Benjamin's expression was determined despite his weakness. "It's time for New Liberty to chart a new course, one that honors both its colonial charter and its native heritage." Grace looked skeptical. "The council will resist. They've built fortunes on broken treaties and stolen land, which is why we need leverage," Julia interjected. "And legitimacy." From a hidden compartment in his desk, Benjamin withdrew a yellowed document bearing multiple seals. "My father's original land grant from the crown," he explained. "It contains a remarkable clause. Overlooked for decades, the territory was granted jointly to the governor and to the Cherokee Nation, represented by Chief Atakulakula, who agreed to the settlement in exchange for permanent protected status for his people." "Our grandfather," Grace breathed, recognizing the Cherokee name. "Yes," Benjamin nodded, "which makes you both, as his direct descendants through your mother, legitimate representatives of Cherokee interests in New Liberty's governance. Boston will never accept such an interpretation," Julia warned. "Boston is 3 months' sail away," Benjamin countered. "By the time their response arrives, we'll have established a new reality, one with enough popular support to make intervention impractical." The plan they formulated over the following days was both bold and pragmatic. Benjamin would remain governor in name, lending colonial legitimacy to the new arrangement. Julia would serve as his official representative in council matters, using her Boston education and political acumen. Grace, once her scars had faded sufficiently, would be introduced as Julia's long-lost twin, a representative of Cherokee interests with equal standing. "It's unprecedented," Julia acknowledged as they finalized the details. But with Jeremiah's treachery exposed, and the matriarch gone, there's a power vacuum. The council members are practical men. They'll accept new leadership if it promises stability. And the Cherokee tribes? Benjamin asked, looking to Grace. Umani has sent word to the elders, she replied. They're cautiously supportive, though they've been betrayed by colonial promises before, which is why we need something more binding than promises, Julia said, extracting another document from the pile. Look at this. In the provincial charter, there's provision for a joint governing council in times of crisis, designed for coordination between militia and civilian authorities during the French conflicts. Benjamin nodded. But it could be reinterpreted. Exactly. Julia's eyes gleamed with strategic intelligence. We establish a temporary joint council, colonial and Cherokee, with you as nominal head. Then, over time, we formalize the arrangement. Grace touched her abdomen, where Benjamin's child continued to grow. And what of the child? Where does she fit in this new order we're creating? Benjamin reached for her hand. She will be acknowledged as my daughter and heir, bridging both worlds. Her existence will help cement the new alliance. The council meets tomorrow, Julia reminded them. We should rest while we can. As Grace and Julia departed, Benjamin called after them. There's one more thing. He opened a small drawer in his desk and withdrew 2 silver objects. I had these made from your mother's pendant designs. Ceremonial seals for each of you, identical except for your names inscribed on the handles. The twins accepted the seals with matching expressions of surprise. You'll need them for official documents, Benjamin explained. Equal authority requires equal symbols of power. That night, Julia found Grace in the mansion's small chapel, sitting alone in the candlelight. Couldn't sleep, Julia asked, sliding into the pew beside her. Grace shook her head. Too much change, too quickly. 1 month ago, I was a marked servant, hiding behind a veil. Tomorrow, I'll help reshape the province's governance. Are you afraid? Terrified, Grace admitted with a small smile. Aren't you? Constantly, Julia confessed. But also, exhilarated for the first time. I'm acting with purpose, not just performing a role assigned to me. They sat in companionable silence. These women who had spent 25 years apart, yet thought with one mind, moved with one rhythm. I've been applying Umani's salve, Grace said finally. Turning her face to the candlelight, the scars were noticeably lighter, the raised edges softening. She said it would take months to fully heal, but already I can see the difference. Julia studied her twin's face with wonder. Soon we'll be truly identical again. But not the same, Grace said thoughtfully. We've lived different lives, learned different lessons. You understand colonial politics and Boston society. I know Cherokee ways and how to survive at the margins. Together, we're exactly what New Liberty needs, Julia realized. Knowledge of both worlds, with the authority to speak for each. As dawn approached, they returned to Benjamin's study, where they found him asleep at his desk, surrounded by documents. The former invalid had worked through the night, preparing for the council meeting that would determine all their fates. Julia gently touched his shoulder. Benjamin. He startled awake, momentarily confused, then smiled at the sisters standing side by side. I was dreaming of the future, he murmured. A bright one. Let's make it reality, Grace said, placing the Cherokee birth record before him. I've found something else, hidden in the binding. Look. Benjamin unfolded a small, brittle document that had been concealed within the leather cover. His eyes widened as he read. A marriage certificate, he whispered, between my father and your mother, performed by a frontier missionary, dated before your birth. The implications were staggering. Julia sank into a chair. We're not illegitimate, she breathed. Our mother wasn't a concubine. She was his lawful wife. The matriarch knew, Grace realized. That's why she went to such lengths to separate us and hide our identities, not just to conceal our Cherokee blood, but because we were the legitimate Clarke heirs. Benjamin looked up, new determination in his eyes. This changes everything. You're not just representatives of the Cherokee interest in New Liberty. You're the rightful inheritors of colonial authority as well. Outside, the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the governor's mansion in gold. In a few hours, the provincial council would convene, expecting routine business from a weakened governor. Instead, they would witness the unveiling of a truth 25 years in the making, and the birth of a governance model unlike any the colonies had seen. With the marriage certificate as their final piece of evidence, the sisters prepared to reclaim their birthright, united in purpose. despite the different paths that had led them to this moment. New Liberty stood on the cusp of transformation, and the daughters of two worlds would lead the way. The provincial council chamber hummed with tension as New Liberty's 12 councilmen took their seats. Mahogany panels lined the walls, and autumn sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like portents. Benjamin entered first, leaning on a walking stick, his face gaunt, but his eyes clear. The councilmen rose respectfully, though their whispers followed him to the governor's chair at the head of the long table. Governor Clarke, Councilman Harrington, a portly merchant who served as council president, greeted him. "We're pleased to see you well enough to join us, though perhaps a longer convalescence would be advisable." "My duties cannot wait for perfect health," Benjamin replied, arranging papers before him with careful precision, particularly given recent events. "Indeed," Harrington nodded gravely. "The loss of the matriarch has shaken the province, and with your brother still absent on frontier business, my brother will not be joining us," Benjamin interrupted, "today or ever again." A ripple of surprise passed through the council. Harrington cleared his throat. "I beg your pardon, Governor." Benjamin met his gaze steadily. "All will be explained, but first, I have two guests whose presence is essential to today's proceedings." At his signal, the chamber doors opened. Julia entered first, dressed in a deep green gown that emphasized her patrician bearing. The council members rose again, bowing respectfully to the governor's wife. Then Grace appeared beside her, without her veil for the first time in public. Though her fading scars were still visible, the sisters' identical features were undeniable. A collective gasp filled the chamber. "Gentlemen," Benjamin announced, "may I present Lady Julia Clarke and her twin sister, Miss Grace Attakullakulla Clarke, daughters of former Governor William Clarke and Princess Alsuna of the Cherokee Nation." For a moment, stunned silence reigned. Then the chamber erupted in chaos. "Impossible. A servant girl. Cherokee blood in the Clarke line. This is outrageous." Benjamin rapped his knuckles sharply on the table. "Order. You will comport yourselves as the leaders of this province, not as tavern gossips." Harrington found his voice first. "Governor, this is unprecedented. You bring a household servant into council chambers, claim she is Lady Julia's twin, and expect us to simply accept this extraordinary tale." "I expect you to examine the evidence," Benjamin replied calmly. Nodding to Julia with practiced dignity, Julia spread several documents on the table. "Gentlemen, before you are the birth records of twin daughters born to Governor William Clarke and his lawfully wedded wife, Princess Alsuna, 25 years ago." She placed the marriage certificate beside them. "You'll note the missionary's seal and the witnesses' signatures, including Chief Attakullakulla, my grandfather. These could be forgeries," a councilman objected. "They are not," countered Judge Willis, the eldest councilman, who had lifted his spectacles to examine the papers. "I recognize Reverend McHenry's signature and seal. He performed marriages on the frontier during the French conflicts." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady despite the hostile stares. "For those who require further proof," she and Julia simultaneously withdrew their pendants, placing them side by side on the table to form the complete seal of the Cherokee chief's lineage. "The tribal seal," whispered a councilman with knowledge of native customs, "split between twins at birth, a sacred tradition." "This is all very theatrical," Harrington blustered. "But what relevance does it have to provincial governance, even if this woman is indeed Lady Julia's sister? She remains half Cherokee, with no standing in colonial affairs." Benjamin's voice hardened. "Their standing derives from two sources. Councilman, first, as the legitimate daughters and heirs of Governor William Clarke. Second, he unfolded his father's original land grant, as representatives of the Cherokee interest explicitly recognized in New Liberty's founding charter." Judge Willis adjusted his spectacles again, peering at the document. "He's right," he confirmed grudgingly. "The original grant establishes joint authority between the colonial governor and Cherokee representatives for determinations of territorial boundaries, a technicality never enforced," another councilman protested. "Nevertheless, legally binding," Benjamin countered. "But there's more at stake today than historical claims. There is treason in our midst." He nodded to Julia again, who distributed copies of Jeremiah's correspondence with French authorities. "These documents, found in Jeremiah Clarke's private study, detail his planned coup against this provincial government. He has promised French officials territorial concessions in exchange for military support to establish himself as an independent governor, breaking ties with both Boston and the Crown. The councilman leafed through the papers, expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. These also explain my mysterious illness, Benjamin continued. Analysis of medicines found in Jeremiah's possession confirms he has been systematically poisoning me for months, creating the impression of incapacity to position himself as the logical successor. Harrington's face had gone pale. Where is Jeremiah now? Missing, Benjamin replied. Last seen pursuing Lady Julia and Miss Grace into Cherokee territory, where he apparently met with frontier justice. A heavy silence fell over the chamber as the implications sank in. What exactly are you proposing, Governor? Judge Willis finally asked. Benjamin straightened in his chair. A new governance structure for New Liberty, honoring both its colonial charter and its founding agreement with the Cherokee Nation. A joint council led by myself as governor, with Lady Julia and Miss Grace as equal representatives of the colonial and Cherokee interests. Predictably, objections erupted once more. Benjamin let them continue for a moment, then raised his hand. Gentlemen, I understand your concerns. This arrangement is unprecedented. But consider our position. Boston is 3 months' sail away. The frontier grows more volatile by the day. Without Cherokee cooperation, our settlements remain vulnerable. And now, with Jeremiah's French connections exposed, we face potential international complications. He leaned forward, his voice strengthening. This solution offers stability, legitimate authority, and a path forward that benefits all of New Liberty's peoples. More practically, it prevents a power vacuum that would invite outside intervention, from Boston, from native tribes, or from foreign powers. The council members exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Willis stroked his beard thoughtfully. You speak of a temporary arrangement, he asked. Initial terms of 1 year, Benjamin confirmed, with provisions for review and adjustment. As debates continued, a commotion outside the chamber drew attention. The doors burst open, revealing a bloodied messenger supported by 2 guards. Governor, the man gasped. Riders approaching, armed men flying Jeremiah Clarke's personal standard, at least 30, moving fast from the western road. Benjamin locked eyes with the twins. They had anticipated many scenarios, but not Jeremiah's return with armed force. How long? He demanded. An hour, maybe less, the messenger replied. Benjamin turned back to the stunned council. Gentlemen, it seems my brother has saved us the trouble of further deliberation. We face an immediate threat to New Liberty's security. I require your decision now. Stand with me and the legitimate government, or risk Jeremiah's private army deciding the province's fate. Harrington rose shakily to his feet. The council stands with the governor, of course, but these women are essential to our defense. Benjamin cut him off. The Cherokee settlements will not mobilize without Miss Grace's authority, and we need their warriors if we're to repel this attack. With reluctant nods, the council acquiesced. In the face of immediate danger, theoretical objections gave way to practical necessities. Prepare the militia, Benjamin ordered, and send riders to the Cherokee settlements with Miss Grace's seal. Tell them Jeremiah Clarke returns with men who would take their lands. As the council dispersed to their emergency duties, Benjamin and the twins remained in the chamber, the sudden gravity of their situation settling over them. He wasn't killed, Grace said quietly. Umani was wrong, or deliberately misled us, Julia suggested. To give us time to find the evidence and prepare. Benjamin shook his head grimly. It doesn't matter now. Jeremiah returns with mercenaries, likely French-backed. If he takes New Liberty, none of us will survive to implement our plans. Grace touched her abdomen protectively. I should go to the Cherokee settlements myself. They'll respond more quickly to my physical presence. Too dangerous, Benjamin and Julia said simultaneously. More dangerous than remaining here, Grace countered. If the settlements don't send warriors, New Liberty falls, and if that happens, she left the consequences unspoken. Benjamin recognized the determination in her eyes, the same expression he'd seen in Julia's when she defended their plan to the council. Neither twin would be dissuaded once her mind was set. Take 4 militia riders, he finally conceded, and stay behind the battle lines. As Grace hurried to prepare, Julia gripped Benjamin's arm. You're still weak from the poison. You can't lead the defense yourself. I must, he replied simply. The militia won't follow anyone else. Outside, the autumn sun continued its arc across the sky, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. In homes and businesses throughout New Liberty, Ordinary people sensed the approach of something momentous, though few understood its true nature. By nightfall, the province would either fall to Jeremiah's coup or emerge transformed by an alliance unprecedented in colonial America. Twin rulers representing two worlds long divided, now united by necessity and blood. 5 years passed like water flowing over stone, gradually reshaping New Liberty into something neither fully colonial nor native, but uniquely its own. The provincial capital bustled with activity on this crisp autumn morning. Merchants from Boston mingled with Cherokee traders in the market square. The courthouse, rebuilt after Jeremiah's failed attack, now featured architecture that blended European columns with native symbols. Above it all flew the new provincial flag, 2 eagles, one golden, one dark, soaring together against a sky-blue background. Inside the governor's mansion, now called Unity Hall, Julia reviewed trade agreements with Boston representatives. At 30, she had grown into her authority, her diplomatic skills honed by years of delicate negotiations between colonial demands and native rights. "These terms are more favorable than our last arrangement," noted the Boston envoy, a thin man who had initially recoiled at the idea of dealing with a woman, let alone one with Cherokee blood. Now he treated her with grudging respect. New Liberty's exports have increased 20% since implementing the joint river navigation rights, Julia replied. Both sides prosper from cooperation. As they concluded their business, a small whirlwind burst into the room. A 4-year-old girl with Benjamin's blue eyes and her mother's copper skin, trailed by an exasperated nursemaid. "Aunt Julia," the child exclaimed, flinging herself against Julia's skirts. "Mother says you're to come now. The delegation from Virginia has arrived, and they brought me a pony." Julia smiled, bending to her niece's level. "Is that so, Alsuna? And did your mother say I should drop everything and run to see this wonderful pony?" The girl nodded solemnly. Those were her exact words. "Somehow I doubt that," Julia laughed, taking the child's hand. "Lead on then. We mustn't keep Virginia waiting." They found Grace in the garden pavilion, receiving the Virginian trading delegation. The scars on her face had faded to faint silver lines, barely visible except in certain light. Like her twin, she carried herself with quiet authority. Her traditional Cherokee-inspired dress complemented by colonial jewelry, a visual representation of the province's blended governance. Benjamin sat nearby, watching the proceedings with evident pride. The poisoning had left its mark. At 47, he looked a decade older, with tremors that occasionally affected his hands. He had officially stepped back from governance 2 years earlier, serving now as an advisor while the twins managed day-to-day affairs. "Ah, Lady Julia," the Virginian envoy greeted her. "Now both of New Liberty's eagles are present." Grace rose to embrace her sister. "Just in time, our friends bring interesting propositions." The delegation outlined trade routes that would connect New Liberty with Virginia and the southern colonies. Bypassing Boston's traditional control of commerce, such arrangements would have been unthinkable before. But the unusual stability and prosperity of the province had made it an attractive partner, despite, or perhaps because of, its unconventional leadership. "We've also brought this," the Virginian added, presenting a sealed letter from Governor Harrison directly. Grace opened it, reading aloud. "New Liberty's example has not gone unnoticed. Several colonies consider similar arrangements with their native neighbors. We seek your counsel on implementation." "Progress," Benjamin murmured, slow but steady, after the delegates departed. The family shared a private lunch in the garden. Benjamin's daughter climbed into his lap, regaling him with stories of her new pony, while the adults discussed the Virginian proposal. "Boston won't like this," Julia observed. "They've tolerated our arrangement because it's been profitable, but expanding the model threatens their authority." "Boston is changing too," Grace countered. "The new governor sent his son to study Cherokee language last spring. That would have been unthinkable when we began." Benjamin stroked his daughter's hair. "The true test comes when this little one takes her place in governance. By then, perhaps the idea of Cherokee blood and leadership won't seem so revolutionary." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger. His expression grave. "Forgive me," he addressed the twins, "but there's an arrival you should know about." "What arrival?" Grace asked, a shadow crossing her face. "Jeremiah Clarke," the messenger replied. "He's been captured at the northern checkpoint." The prison cell was spare but clean. Stone walls, a narrow window, a simple cot. Jeremiah Clarke sat rigidly on the edge of the bed, his once handsome face gaunt and weathered. 5 years of exile had transformed him. stripping away his aristocratic polish and leaving something harder beneath. The cell door opened, and the twins entered together. Jeremiah looked up, momentarily disoriented by their identical features, before recognition dawned. "The sisters Clarke?" he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Come to gloat over the prodigal brother's return." "We came to understand why," Julia replied coolly. "Why return when you must have known capture was inevitable?" Jeremiah laughed bitterly. "Perhaps I missed the comforts of home, or perhaps I grew tired of French hospitality, which cooled considerably when their planned coup failed to materialize." Grace studied him with narrowed eyes. "You could have disappeared to the West Indies or the Spanish territories. Why risk hanging as a traitor?" "Hanging?" Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "Is that my sentence, then?" "The council meets tomorrow to decide," Julia informed him. "Your attack killed 17 militiamen and wounded dozens more. The Cherokee lost 9 warriors. By any measure, it's treason." Jeremiah's gaze shifted between them, calculating as ever. "And if I have information to trade? Intelligence about French plans for the Western territories? Boston's secret negotiations with the Iroquois? Is that why you've returned?" Grace asked. "To barter for your life?" "I returned because I'm dying," Jeremiah stated flatly. "Consumption. The physicians give me 6 months." He gestured to the blood-stained handkerchief beside him. "I've come home to be buried in Clarke soil, not foreign clay." The stark admission hung in the air between them. "That doesn't explain the intelligence you're offering," Julia noted. A ghost of Jeremiah's old smile appeared. "Consider it a peace offering, a final act of service to New Liberty, if not to the family that rejected me. You poisoned Benjamin," Grace reminded him coldly. "You tried to kill us in the mountains. You led mercenaries against your own province, and you turned everything upside down," Jeremiah countered, sudden anger flaring. "Half-breed women ruling where Clarks governed for generations, Cherokee symbols on provincial documents, native languages taught in schools." He shook his head in disgust. "My father would never have allowed it." "Our father," Julia corrected quietly, "married a Cherokee princess and recognized his daughter's birthright. The matriarch confirmed it before she died." Jeremiah stared at her. "What are you talking about?" The twins exchanged glances, realization dawning. "You didn't know," Grace said softly, "about the marriage certificate, about our legitimacy. The matriarch told us everything in her final confession," Julia added. "How she separated us at birth, how she concealed our mother's lawful marriage to Governor Clarke." Jeremiah's face drained of color. "She wouldn't have hidden such information from me. We planned everything together. She kept secrets from everyone," Grace said, "including you, apparently." Jeremiah sank back onto the cot, the revelation seemingly affecting him more than his impending death. "Then I never had a legitimate claim," he whispered. "All of it. The poison, the coup attempt, the years in exile. For nothing." The twins left him to his bitter epiphany, stepping into the corridor where Benjamin waited. "Well," he asked. "He's dying," Julia replied, "and offering intelligence in exchange for clemency." "He didn't know about the marriage certificate," Grace added. "The matriarch kept him in the dark about our true status." Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. "That explains his persistence. He truly believed he was fighting against illegitimate usurpers." He sighed heavily. "What will you do with him?" The sisters shared one of their wordless communications, a talent that had only strengthened over the years. "House arrest," Julia decided. "In the North Wing, away from your family but with medical attention. He can provide his intelligence," Grace continued, "and die with dignity, if not honor. Mercy," Benjamin observed with a small smile. "Your mother's quality," according to those who knew her. They walked together through Unity Hall. Its corridors transformed from the dark, oppressive spaces of the matriarch's time into light-filled galleries featuring both European paintings and Cherokee crafts. In the main reception hall, a large tapestry depicted the Battle of New Liberty, where provincial militia and Cherokee warriors had repelled Jeremiah's mercenaries. Beneath it, inscribed in both English and Cherokee, was the province's new motto: "Neither blood nor power defines the worth of those who govern, but love for the people this land sustains." Outside, the autumn sun gilded New Liberty's rooftops. In the marketplace, a storyteller gathered children, colonial and native alike, to hear tales of two sisters separated by cruelty, reunited by destiny, who brought together two worlds long divided, and high above, catching the last light of day, two carved eagles adorned Unity Hall's entrance, one golden, one dark, their wings touching as they soared into a shared future neither could have achieved alone.